Professor LaGumina, you wrote, your most recent book is Long Island Italian Americans, which was published in 2013. It's a book in which you explain how and why Americans came to settle on Long Island, but especially you note how they contributed to the economic, political, social, and cultural development of the area. Why did Italian Americans come to Long Island?
That's a very good question. In view of the fact that in the early period of immigration, you find a concentration of Italian Americans in the big cities, where the jobs were, etc. However, right from the beginning, and I'm talking about the 1880s and 1890s on into the early part of the 20th century, there were enclaves of Italian Americans on Long Island.
And what were they doing there?
Okay. There are at least a half a dozen or more communities where they formed small but functioning Italian enclaves. What were they doing? For the most part, they came here to work, and that's what they were doing. For example, in the Westbury area, the work that they undertook was mostly in landscaping and working for the landscaping companies and the big garden concerns like the Hicks Nursery. There were hundreds of Italian immigrants who worked in that field. Others worked in estates. At one time, as we know, Long Island had a number of very fabulous estates that were mostly self-sufficient. They had to grow their food and tend their land, etc. And increasingly, the workforce was of Italian background. Another example in terms of work, the extension of the Long Island Railroad. Now, up until the early part of the 20th century, the extension of the Long Island Railroad was very limited into Suffolk County. The railroad obviously wanted to develop and expand into Suffolk County, into the North Shore and the South Shore, and a lot of the actual laborers were Italian immigrants and their children by the hundreds. They worked building and constructing the railroad. They also worked for the Long Island Railroads. The Long Island Railroad, I should point out, the early part of the 20th century, in order to entice people into Suffolk County, emphasize the growing, the ability and growing crop, vegetables, etc., in the soil of Long Island. And what they did is they came up with, the railroad came up with 2 experimental farms. And they used the Italian immigrants to grow vegetables to demonstrate, these were exhibits, to demonstrate that you could grow crop profitably. So there are numerous examples of the Italian immigrants coming here to work. And these are just a few of the examples.
Professor, in the book you also talk about Italian American political participation. In the beginning, not so strong. Today,
yes,
you identified a number of dynasties.
Right. Yeah, the emergence of Italian Americans in politics is a very interesting and I think unique kind of a story. The presence of these small enclaves that I mentioned earlier found a handful of Italian Americans emerging and achieving some positions of, let's say, minor political importance. Some of the first positions, incidentally, in terms of public positions, were as deputy sheriffs.
Why deputy sheriffs?
Well, I think it was to have a representation of the ethnic group in the policing force, which is, I think, a timely thing when you consider the racial factors.
The an example of community policing.
Yeah, they realized that many of the people that they had to deal with in these communities were of Italian background, and if you had someone in the police force who was part of that background and culture, etc., it would they would be more responsive, and the community would be more accepting. Then they began to strive for positions on the school boards or in the fire departments. Interestingly, the positions in the fire departments today are not necessarily considered political, but at one time that was the way to achieve some local influence politically. New York City was a perfect example. Al Smith, who became very powerful in the Democratic Party, he started out in the local fire department. And so they began to strive for those positions in Long Island as well. The first Italian American to become prominent on a county-wide basis was Frank Galata. In the mid-1940s, he was the first Italian American in Nassau County to be elected to a county-wide position as district attorney. And then, of course, we have many, many other examples. Roughly from 1970 to the present, with two exceptions, every county executive in Nassau County has been of Italian background, starting with Queso and Galata and so on and so forth.
You also mentioned the Swazi family.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. If anybody wants to study local politics, Glen Cove is an ideal place to look at. It's a municipality. We have two in Nassau County, Long Beach and Glen Cove. It has its own incorporated municipal structure. And the Italian-American element there represented at least a third by the 1930s. And they began to achieve positions of influence and power in both parties, incidentally. They were represented in both political parties.
Which was kind of strange, because when they were in New York City, Italian Americans were almost all of them were Democrats, right?
Exactly, yes. But however, in the suburbs, the realization was that power was in the Republican Party. And so I think for pragmatic reasons, rather than ideological, they swung to the Republican Party and saw that they had a place at the table, so to speak.
So we had Italian Americans in the Republican Party. They were Democrats in Republicans' clothing.
Now in Glen Cove, you had the dynasty, the most famous dynasty, is the Swazi family. Joseph Swazi, who's still alive in his mid-90s, was the first of that clan to become mayor of the city, and then his brother Vincent Swazi, and their two sons, Thomas and Vincent's son Ralph Swazi. They all became mayors of Glen Cove. I don't think there's any other community that I know of in the United States, especially dealing with Italian Americans, that you could say there are four mayors from one family, of mayors of Tom
Swazi is he still the mayor of Glen Cove?
No, it's not a Swazi now. The last Swazi was his cousin, Vincent's son, who lost re-election, but he's now serving, I believe, as the in Garden City in a paid position as an administrator.
Of course, Tom Swazi at one time ran for governor of New York.
Exactly. Tom Swazi had a great potential. I think he still does. He's very personable and
still relatively young.
Still relatively young. So that was very unique. One of the things I want to mention about politics in Glen Cove, and why I stress it as an example, I should say, is that in the heyday of the pre-television period, late 40s, early 50s, when there would be meetings at City Hall, they would go on into the middle of the night, and they would be jam-packed.
Could you talk a little bit about Joe Margiotta?
Joe Margiotta had achieved, he's sometimes considered the last of the big political bosses in the 20th century, because he had achieved a position as Republican the county Republican leader. He had other positions. He had been elected to the state assembly and a couple of other positions, but running the Republican Party became his identity, and he ran it like a fiefdom in a sense, and it got him into trouble later on when investigations indicated that he insisted that every civil service employee had to ante up so much money, whether they were members of that party or supported the candidates or not.
Of course, they don't do that now, of course,
no.
Right?
So that caused him some trouble later on in his career. But for a number of years, he was very powerful, meaning that his approval would be necessary for anybody to run for a lot of the offices in the county or in the state to get the nomination for a state assembly or state senator, and even for governors. He had a lot of say as to who the candidate of the Republican
So
Party would be.
he had a local power base, but he also was very influential statewide.
And given the role and the impact of New York State in politics nationwide, that meant he had some clout nationwide as well. So it was a very powerful position, and he really demonstrated what could be done in that kind of a role. But like a lot of other political bosses before him, he got into trouble, and his career then came to an end.
Let's talk about another aspect of life for Italian Americans on Long Island, and that's the Catholic Church. I don't know why I was surprised, but I was a little surprised at how influential they were in building Catholic churches in both counties, Nassau and Suffolk, and establishing a certain liturgy, if you will, with regard to that. And there were also a little bit of tension when you had Italian Americans going to church, and you had Irish American pastors.
Yes, that always has been an interesting part of the religious history. Going back to Italy, most Italians were Catholic, if not fully practicing, at least in name, and many of their customs and saint devotions reflected this background. There were a small and interesting group who were not Catholics and were Protestants, and also who appeared in Long Island. But it's true that most of them were Catholic, and so they came to an area of the state and the country that had Catholic churches in many instances, but churches that were established by the Irish Catholics who came a couple of generations before them. And sometimes they were not always welcome. A lot has to do with the background and the culture. In Italy, the tradition was that the state generally supported the churches and the clergy, and therefore they were not accustomed, the rank and file church members were not accustomed to donating and contributing. Here it was a different proposition, separation of church and state, and therefore they had to financially support it, so that would be a problem. Other things that constituted problems were the devotions and the practices of the Italians, especially saint celebrations, and
the Irish weren't into saint celebrations.
Well, not in the same way, with the same degree of emotion and outpouring, and they frequently looked at this as on the bordering on mythology and things that they were not part of the Irish culture. So that presented a problem that had to be resolved. But the wiser Italian, or I should say the wiser Irish pastors, realized that it would be best to accommodate them. Let me give you one example. In Westbury, there was an existing Catholic parish, St. Bridget's, probably the oldest Catholic parish in Nassau County. Goes back to the mid-19th century. That was started by Irish immigrants. When the Italians started moving into Westbury by the late 19th, early part of the 20th century, a growing number of them were present, and they wanted the celebration of their saint. They were the Westbury Italians came principally from 3 towns near Naples, and each one had a favorite saint from the town that they wanted St. Bridget's to acknowledge. And the Irish pastor realized that if he selected one of these, he would alienate the other 2 groups. So he concluded that all the Italian people liked the Blessed Mother. So out of that came the Feast of the Dell'Assunta, the Assumption of the Blessed Mother, and the organization, there's still an organization called the Dell'Assunta Society in Westbury that's well over 100 years old, and it reflects this background. And so that accommodated the Italian Americans in that area. In other places, they resorted to building their own churches. In the Inwood area of Long Island, southwestern part near the Rockaways, there was no Catholic church there initially, and so the Italians began to construct their own church, and with a lot of Irish help, I might add. Another example is Our Lady of the Assumption in Copac, right nearby here, which also found the Italian immigrants building this church. Even physically, I remember interviewing one of the early pastors who physically donned work clothes to help construct the walls, etc. And so that had a sort of an Italian flavor to it. And in the pre-Vatican days, the nationality and the language that was represented became the language that was used in homilies and in organizational activity, etc. So there's a lot of dynamic activity along those lines. Patriarch had a similar thing. And of course, the best example of the Italian Catholic ethnic church would be St. Rocco's in Glen Cove. Prior to St. Rocco's, there were already 2 Catholic churches in Glen Cove. St. Patrick's, which had an Irish background, and St. Hyacinth had a Polish background. And then the Italians wanted to have their own church because of their interest in their culture and background and so on. And it was this came to fruition in the mid-1930s, which was during the tight economic situation of the Great Depression. And so the bishop of the Brooklyn Diocese, of which Long Island was part at the time, Bishop Malloy, was not too keen on the idea. However, the Glen Cove people presented a petition signed by over 1,000 people and presented it to a visiting cardinal who was staying in Manhasset, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, and used his influence to have them get permission to build a Catholic church in Glen Cove. The next year, 1937, they began to construct this. And of course, Eugenio Pacelli became the next pope, Pope Pius XII. So there are various ways of getting around things.
So Catholic Italian Americans, they had a fantastic connection. Let me talk a little bit more about Italian Americans and ethnic identity. Obviously, first, second generation, a very, very strong ethnic identity.
Yeah.
Do Italian Americans, third, fourth, maybe even fifth generation, do they still have that strong ethnic identity?
To a certain degree, I think they do. In some respects, it's not as visible as it once was. I would think that many, especially third, fourth generation, etc., many people with Italian names cannot speak Italian. So if you're using a barometer of language as a basis for ethnic identification, that seems to have withered. Some of them, of course, still can handle the Italian language, but many of them cannot. On the other hand, there are still a number of organizations representing Italian background, perhaps the most prominent being the Sons of Italy. There are a number of Sons of Italy lodges in both Nassau and Suffolk, probably a couple of dozen of them. And so they're all still functioning, some healthier than others, but they're still out there. There's representations of that group and others. There are centers of Italian American studies in places like my college, Nassau Community College.
You chair the Center for Italian American Studies at Nassau Community College.
Yes, and most colleges on Long Island have expressions of Italian activity. Hofstra University puts on a very big Italian festival in September, and most of the other colleges have some. Stony Brook has a great Italian center, and they have many programs dealing with Italian culture, language, etc. Another area that one can look at regarding the Italian identity is the study of Italian language in high school especially. That's an ongoing issue because there's always a tendency on the part of some of the school people to erode the Italian language study in favor of other languages, but there's still a healthy representation of Italian Americans and others studying the Italian language. It's not merely those of Italian background, which is interesting.